Good afternoon. Hope everybody's doing fine. Well, I have the pleasure of having Rabbi Joshua Aaronson here. Sven was born and raised in Philadelphia. We had the conversation about that. He attended the University of Michigan and was ordained at the Hebrew Union College's Jewish Institute of Religion in New York City, where he also received his Doctor of Divinity. In July 2013, Rabbi Aaronson became the senior rabbi at Temple Judea, a Reformed congregation in Tarzana, California. Prior to coming to California, he served as the associate rabbi at Temple Beth Zion of Buffalo and Fairmont Temple of Cleveland, as the acting senior rabbi of Fairmont Temple, and as the rabbi of Temple David in Perth, Australia. So he stayed on the other side of the U.S. and also on the other side of the world, I suppose. How's the weather feel like here after serving in Cleveland for some years? Way better. Temple Judea has a congregation of almost 1,000 families. In the short time Rabbi Aaronson has been at Temple Judea, he's created some exceptional programs, including an educational and engaging conversation with Stan Dewitt Duss and J Street, two approaches for supporting Israel, which he moderated. To observe the second night of Passover under his leadership, Temple Judea has a new tradition of Not Your Zayda Seder. During his tenure at Temple Har Shalom, membership grew from about 100 households to over 300. So please help me welcome Rabbi Aaronson.
Good afternoon. This microphone is just to speak into the, not for you to, y'all to hear. Yeah, you don't have to worry about that. So thanks. Really thrilled to be here. We have our community at Judea has a wonderful emerging relationship with the Pacifica Institute, and it's really been great for our community. I hope it's been as good for your community as well. So my topic for this afternoon, is the Ten Commandments. And I want to speak about that. Also would love to, afterwards we'll take some questions. I'd like to only speak for about 15 minutes actually on the topic, and then I'd love to really hear your questions about it and what you have to say. So this is a wonderful, propitious time to speak about the Ten Commandments and to speak about commandments at all in the Jewish tradition. Why is that? That's because, sorry, I have a sinus condition that's causing me to cough all the time. Passover was the major festival we previously observed about 4 weeks ago, and 3.5 weeks ago, whatever. Passover, I have water here, thanks. And Passover commemorates, I think as most people know, the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The Jews who were enslaved in Egypt were redeemed with the hand of God. We crossed the Red Sea under the leadership of Moses. We went into the Promised Land. We spent 40 years in the wilderness, and then ultimately were redeemed into the Promised Land, as told in the book of Joshua. What makes this period of time interesting for this topic is that Jews believe that the next holiday that comes, which is called Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, because there's 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks commemorates the giving of the commandments. So it's a very opportune time for us to be here together talking about what the commandments are and what role the commandments play in Judaism. So let me just talk about commandments in general in Judaism, and then let me focus in on the Ten Commandments. And I actually bought the copy of the Ten Commandments, not the real copy of the Ten Commandments, just on paper. I bought a version of the Ten Commandments that I want to share with all of you. So this idea of commandment in Judaism is almost core. Obviously, God is the central premise, but the idea of commandment is really the way in which Jews relate to God. And the premise, of course, unsurprisingly, is that these commandments emanate from God, come from God. For Jews, there are 613 commandments inferred from the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Jews believe that there are 613 commandments, and all of those commandments are incumbent upon Jews to observe. Having said that, there's a bunch of those commandments that can't be observed because, for example, the temple in Israel and Jerusalem no longer exists, and many of the commandments have to do with the temple. And there are a whole variety of other things that we need to talk about. But the premise of this 613, this idea of commandments, is very, very central. What people call the Ten Commandments is only one way of organizing the commandments in Judaism. You can organize the commandments in other ways. For example, you can organize the commandments in terms of negative and positive commandments. Positive commandment would be do this, observe the Shabbat. A negative commandment would be don't do this, you should not murder. So there's two right there. There's two different ways of organizing commandments. There are several other systems that one can use to organize the commandments. Also, the Ten Commandments are not the first 10 commandments that are given. If you were to ask yourself, what's the first commandment that actually occurs chronologically in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses? The answer to that question would be fruitful and multiply, in terms of the beginning from Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy. So there's a whole variety of ways that people understand these commandments to occur. Hi, welcome. So let's talk also about what I think most of you know, but it's good to get out on the table. The commandments, according to history, were given to Moses by God on Mount Sinai. I think most people also know there are 2 sets of commandments in the terms of the 10. Moses goes up, he comes down, he sees the golden calf being built, he drops the first set of commandments, he needs to go get another set of commandments. Some Jewish commentators opine that that's the reason in these 5 books of Moses that there actually are 2 versions of the 10 commandments. There's a version listed in Exodus, and there's a version listed in Deuteronomy. And some people believe that one version, the first version in Exodus, represents the first set of commandments that Moses brought down from the top of Sinai, and then the second in Deuteronomy represents the second version that Moses subsequently brought down from Sinai. So, having said all that, I want to get into the 10 Commandments, but I want to raise one other really important point that you need to understand about Judaism in general. Judaism does not understand our sacred scripture, the Torah, in isolation. We understand our Torah, which is the written law, with the voluminous collection of law that we refer to as the oral law, which is a collection of commentary, and now it's written down. The theory was at one time it wasn't written down, hence the oral law. It was passed from one generation to the other. And the reason it's important for you to know that is because a lot of the things I'm going to tell you are things that I have learned from the study of this oral tradition. It's an interpretive tradition of the text. It's an interpretive tradition of what the actual commandments mean. There are very few Jews, I would venture to say there are no Jews, others would disagree with me. There are no Jews who only observe Judaism based on what's written in the Torah, because that Judaism has to go through a refractive lens of interpretation that is known as the oral law. So I'm happy to answer that question and talk about what that means and how that goes. But in the meantime, let's turn our attention to the 10 Commandments and understand a little bit about them. So if you'd be kind enough to take one and pass them around. Now, recall, I'm sure you recall, because you probably are hanging on my every word and you've memorized everything I've said already, that there are 613 commandments. So then I just give you these 10 commandments. What could that mean? Jews believe, and when I say Jews, I mean the rabbis who left us this oral tradition, believe that these 10 commandments contain within them the other 603 commandments. No, the other 603. These are 10, and then the other 603 are all inferred from these commandments. And that through a process of logical deduction, one could deduce all of the other commandments based on these. We're not going to do that exercise this morning. We're just simply going to take them at their word, and we're going to focus on what these kinds of commandments mean and how they're organized. So I've created 2 columns for you. The column on the left and the column on the right differ, some people would say, and again, this is from the oral law. The column on the left would be commandments that have to govern the relationship between God and human beings. The commandments on the right govern the relationship between human beings, one human being and another human being. This is just one way to look at them because we have a short amount of time. I could have organized them in several different other ways, but for the moment, I use this commonly to teach. And these are shorthand. I haven't translated exactly the 10 commandments from Hebrew. I've just given us a rubric and a way to understand these because I want to do a little bit of explanation. So one thing that pops out at you is to have a little interaction. I've told you that the left column is commandments that govern the relationship between God and human beings. But what do you notice about that? What's peculiar? What stands out? The parents. That would seem, how did that get in that? That's exactly right. How did the parents get into the left-hand column? And the reason that the rabbis ordered this way is the rabbis feel that your relationship as a child or as even an adult child with your parents is really the same as your relationship with God. Why would that be? What do your parents do for you that God does for everybody? They do protect you, nurse you, authority. I'm looking for one other word. How did you come into this world? Create you. So from the very beginning, God creates all of humanity and everything in the world, not just humanity. Your parents on a smaller level do that for your life. They are your creator. And we learn in the way you're supposed to treat your parents, if we read the oral law about this particular commandment, we learn a whole variety of different things about what that means and why you really have to be honor to, why the honor parents is put on the side of your relationship with God. And let me give you one interesting example. So you're not allowed to say anything bad about your parents, even if they're bad. Judaism recognizes that not all parents are actually good. To take one easy example, your parent could be a criminal. Your parent could be a thief. Your parent could be a murderer. Your parent could be all kinds of different things, right? Your parent could be Meyer Lansky, the guy from the mafia, right? So if you know that your parent is an evil person or not a good person, the oral law asks, are you allowed to say something bad about your parent? And the answer is no, you're not allowed to say something bad about your parent under any circumstance whatsoever because your parent is your creator. And that's actually connected to the third commandment, which is the prohibition against false oaths. It also has to do with, that commandment also contains the prohibition against taking the name of God in vain. We know that from taking the name of God in vain, you cannot, according to this, you can't even kid around about saying something negative about God, according to this. Even if you're just joking, because that qualifies as disparaging your creator, even if you're doing it jokingly. So it's kind of put against this idea that even there's no circumstance under which you can say anything negative about God, whether it could, of course it's not, but whether it could be true or whether it could be joking, and you can't say anything negative about your parents, even if there is something in reality true to be said. And that's because that's the way we go about honoring your parent. And that's an interesting kind of juxtaposition about how we begin to understand some of these commandments, and we begin to see and understand some of the nuances of how these commandments work. So I want to go through some of these commandments and pick some of the ones and talk about what they mean, and then open the floor up for further discussion. So, belief in God, this certainly is shared very, very closely and almost in identical form with Islam to start, and to a large extent with Christianity. And certainly with Islam, there is Judaism, there is only one God. What does that mean? That means that in our tradition, God is the creator of good and evil. There is no opposing force that creates evil in the Jewish world, because there's only one God. Therefore, God must create everything. We don't have time for a long discussion of why does God create evil, which is a huge, voluminous topic that's well worth discussing. But it's an important point to note that according to this system, God is the creator of evil. So there is one God, period. There is nothing equated to God. There is nothing like God. There is no, this is the first creed, the first statement of Judaism. There is one God. There's no way to parse that, shape that, discuss that. And the reality is that Judaism and the Talmud, which is one of these oral law things, spent a long time talking about whether Christianity could qualify as a monotheistic religion because of the Christian belief in the Trinity. Ultimately, Judaism came to believe that, at least according to the Talmud, that Christianity was in fact a monotheistic religion. But it was a subject of a rather large debate. And I don't want to go into that right now, but this idea of a monotheistic religion is crucial to understanding what it means to be Jewish. This is why Jews spend so much time, and Christians too, and other faith traditions, wrestling with, for example, the book of Job. If you're familiar with the book of Job, where God visits upon this guy Job all these terrible things, even though Job's a good guy, why would God do that? It's a book of the Old Testament, so it's a very problematic kind of thing. Why does God create evil? But this is the basis, this is the fundamental Grundnorm, we call it. This is the basic foundational statement of Judaism. With that comes the next two, which are prohibition against idol worship and prohibition against false oaths. The idea with idol worship is that it doesn't just simply mean idols, which is a pretty easy sell. You can't have a little figurine that's the god of the moon. You can't have a tall statue that's the god of the sun. There's nothing like that. But it also is a prohibition against creating other things into idols, such as you can't create wealth into an idol. You can't put poverty, make poverty as an idol. There's many things that stem from this. Nothing can be an idol. There's only one deity to worship, that is God. And the prohibition against false oaths and taking the name of God in vain also has to do with this idea that by creating a false oath, you're really setting up an idol in many, many ways, because you're defaming the name of God because this oath is in the name of God. That's what this means. And the prohibition against oaths, number 3, in comparison to number 9, has to do with whether you're making the statement in the name of God. Sanctifying the Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, which is Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, is the main ritual experience that Jews have between God and the Jewish people. And the observance, the celebration, that is the key piece, the key way we celebrate God, the recognition of God as the creator, God as one, all the things that I've talked about previously. We talked a little bit about honoring parents, and what that means, and the importance that's played on that. It also translates into honoring your elders. There's theoretically a rule, if you study Judaism long enough, you come across this rule. It's pretty significant. You're not allowed to disagree with your teachers. So in other words, if I teach my students something, if I'm a head of a yeshiva, Jewish study hall for rabbis, my students are not supposed to say anything that contradicts what I taught them. It turns out, in fact, I hate to tell you this, to be completely untrue, and everybody contradicts their teachers all the time, but it's meant to be done in a certain way with respect, and a certain way with dignity, and a certain way where essentially you have to say, well, of course my teacher is right. I'd like to talk about this, where you then go and prove your teacher's completely wrong. So it's an interesting way of doing things. The next set of prohibitions comes against, it talks about our relationship, one human being to the other. And I phrase them in specific ways for specific reasons. So in the case of a prohibition against murder, I do not phrase that. Commonly we translate this not as thou shalt not murder, but thou shalt not kill, which is false. Judaism acknowledges that killing sometimes takes place and sometimes can be justified. What is not ever permissible is murder, and therefore the question begins, what is murder? Under what circumstances is murder translated into killing, and so on. But Judaism is not a religion that makes it impossible to kill under any circumstances, but the circumstances under which you are allowed to kill are very limited and very restricted. The prohibition against adultery is actually not as clear as it seems either in Jewish law, because for a long time, over 1,000 years, Judaism permitted polygamy. And in fact, in parts of the Jewish world, what's known as the Sephardic Jewish world, which is the Jewish world in the Arab countries and in a lot of other places outside of Europe, permitted polygamy even up to the time the State of Israel was founded. And Israel had to make a grandfather clause to allow polygamous relationships in 1948 to be acknowledged in Israel. They're banned if you were in a polygamous relationship prior to 1948 and you moved to Israel. That was acknowledged. Going forward, there was nothing but monogamy permitted. So the adultery prohibition is a kind of more complicated thing than it. You didn't know that? Yeah, it's quite clear. I can go into the whole history of adultery and polygamy in the in Judaism, but it's quite clear that the prohibition against adultery has a number of different qualifiers to it, and it basically means having a relationship with if you yourself are in a sanctified relationship, and it primarily applies in this way, you can't have a relationship with another person, mostly a woman, in other words, man to woman. You can't have a relationship with a woman who is either ineligible for you, or previously betrothed. That's what it means. But if I am a man in a sanctified relationship, according to Jewish law, I can have a relationship with another woman who is not prohibited to me by a whole variety of different reasons, as long as she is not betrothed to someone else. And then she automatically becomes my wife. Long story. Prohibition against stealing, that happens to be pretty straightforward. I could go into the nuances of that, but it happens to be pretty straightforward. The prohibition against false witness is huge, and it's not just thou shalt not lie. It is the prohibition against false witness, which means a couple different things. I can't testify against you in a court of law on a fact that I know to be false in order to incarcerate you, but also many commentators believe, even if I was told something by someone, I saw Joe kill Pete, I can't even testify to that fact in a court of law. That would still be a prohibition against false witness. Some people believe you can only testify in a Jewish law court to things that you actually saw with your own eyes, or you actually heard someone say that is not qualify for what we would call in law heresy, the hearsay rule. So it's an interesting twist on exactly what that means. And you're not also allowed, let's say, let's go back to Hitler. Hitler did a lot of things. Let's say, though, I had no personal experience with Hitler. I can't simply, though, come forward and say Hitler did something bad, even though he is actually guilty of doing a lot of things bad, unless he did something bad to me personally, or I saw him do something to someone else directly. You can't even get in on, even if a person's clearly guilty, you still can be convicted of false witness if you testify falsely against a guilty person. And then the prohibition against coveting, again, some largely straightforward, that is to say, it largely applies, of course, to things like a spouse, but it also applies to possessions and other things. You have a car that I really like, and the idea that I would covet your car, want your car, that is prohibited against this as well. And why is that in the Ten Commandments? You may not think that rises to the threshold of being in the Ten Commandments. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Okay, so you have a Bentley, and I am in a little tiny whatever, and so I think I should have a Bentley. Why is that such a big deal to be in the Ten Commandments? And the reason is because the implication there is what you're saying is that it's a sign of hubris. You are not deserving of your Bentley, and I am. And hubris is one of the biggest sins in Judaism. So it's the underlying motive for this has to do with hubris and the idea that when I covet something you have, I'm not just saying you have a nice house, I'd like that house. What you're saying is that you are not worthy I am more worthy than you of the house in which you live. So there's a kind of quick little thumbnail sketch of the Ten Commandments and commandments in general. And I'd like to kind of open it now to some questions and be a little bit more interactive with all of you. Yes?
First question from you.
Sure.
If you can elaborate on the laws, the written laws and the Talmud and Torah and interpretation of that.
Sure.
Can you elaborate on this?
Absolutely. So the theory is that there are two sections of law, the written law and the oral law. To people who believe this interpretation, both the oral law and the written law were handed to Moses on Mount Sinai and are equally authoritative. The written law obviously was the 5 books of Moses, which was given to Moses right there. The oral law was also given to Moses, and Moses gave that to Joshua and the elders as well. But that law was revealed over the course of hundreds of years by humans to whom it was transmitted in a chain that began with Moses and Joshua. And eventually it became written down. But it is absolutely as authoritative as the written law. I actually did my rabbinic thesis on the oral law, and what I would tell you, this isn't heresy by even many Orthodox Jews, clearly the written law was written by real people that we know existed, and they're identified in the oral law. These people are actually identified in the oral law. Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai, all of these rabbis that we know, and we have evidence that they existed outside of what's called the Talmud, which is the main history of this oral law. We know they existed, and we know how they came to write these things down. It's a whole long rigmarole, but the theory is, as I've just explained.
They wrote the oral law.
Say again?
They wrote the oral law.
Those rabbis wrote the oral law, correct. Not the written law. Correct. Yes?
Rabbi, in Judaism, are there limitations on the attributes of God? For example, is the God omnipotent? Is the God all-merciful? I mean, if that's the case, for example, how could you reconcile with all-merciful and all-just, for example? All-merciful requires that you forgive everything, even the sins to God himself or the people.
Right.
All-just requires there should be some kind of retribution, some kind of punishment. So,
Right.
one portion of the question. The other one is God all omnipotent. Is there any limitations on God's?
So there's a lot of thinking about this. Let's answer the second part first. There's a lot of thinking about this. Maimonides, who was one of in my opinion, the greatest sage of the Jewish people in our history, Maimonides suggests that the only thing you can say with certainty is what God is not, and that it's impossible to say with certainty what God is. So you can say that, for example, God does not have any human characteristics as we understand them. God is not doesn't have a body. God is neither male nor female. God doesn't have hair. God doesn't have an arm. All of these kinds of things you can say with certainty. God is not. But Maimonides suggests, not he doesn't suggest, he states explicitly that you can't know for sure what God is. You can only carve out the space of what God is not, and then everything else is what God is. So, having said that, there's many references in the tradition to the idea that God is just, and God is merciful, and God is compassionate. The idea that you point out, and in general, most Jewish thinkers who think about this certainly believe that God has the three characteristics of the Western God, which is God is omnipotent, God, which, all powerful. God is omniscient, which means he's all knowing, and God is omnipresent, which God is everywhere. Most thinkers believe that God has those attributes, but as I said, most people, Judaism tries very hard to refrain from saying for sure what God is. In terms of the conundrum example of justice, you'd have to separate that discussion out into divine justice versus human justice. Certainly when it comes to meting out divine justice, Judaism suggests that God is compassionate. But that does not mean that we here on earth aren't entitled to mete out human justice that puts a person in jail for life or whatever that may be. We don't fully understand divine justice, and we don't fully understand how God beats out mercy in the end of days or when you meet your maker, so to speak. But in those realms, God acts, we believe, justly and with mercy. That's a separate issue about how humans mete out justice against humans. We can get more of that if you want to go and talk about that. Yes?
In the Jewish religion, in the Torah, it started where God, the Jewish God, believed that there were other gods in Egypt, for example. Uvchol Elohim Mitzrayim Shvatim.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, so didn't God know that he was alone? It seems that over time, the monotheism kind of evolved, but it did not begin at the beginning of the Torah. God did not know that he was alone. That's why he said, I'm going to punish the gods of Egypt.
Right. No question that according to the narrative of the Torah, God was not the only God, and that God was the only God. People believed that there were other gods, and that God was kind of convincing people that, in fact, there is only one God. There is a school of thought that says...
But it said that God himself, he is speaking. I'm going to punish them. I'm going to show, the people how
Right.
strong I am.
Correct.
So he did not realize, at that point, he still did not know that he was alone.
That's one interpretation. There are other interpretations. Again, it would be in the oral law, where God, in fact, knows that God is God and there is only one God. What God is convincing humans of is that fact.
You mentioned Maimonides, the second Moses, Judaism,
Yeah.
second Moses.
Yeah.
And he said that Christianity, because they believe that Jesus is God,
Mm-hmm.
that it is idolatry.
He did.
And you said that in the Talmud, the Rabbanim arrived at the conclusion after a large debate that Christianity, they somehow found a way around Maimonides.
The Talmud came before Maimonides.
Right, so if Maimonides...
Maimonides rejected the opinion of the Talmud.
Okay, so from what I know, the sages of Israel, throughout the generations, maintained, they respected Maimonides. And so they maintain that Christianity is idolatry. They don't, to believe that a man is God, Son of God, the concept of the Trinity that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
is unacceptable.
Not unless you believe that it's the same entity.
Right.
Don't we, Judaism, have Ruach HaKodesh and Shekhinah, etc.? So we have the same, maybe a similar idea of the Holy Trinity.
Most of the Jewish commentators don't believe that, for example, the Shekhinah is equivalent to Jesus being the incorporate presence of God. But you are right, sir, that, look, Judaism has, the discussion in the Talmud that begins, the discussion in the Talmud where this subject is raised begins with this question: is it possible, if I am a merchant, to sell a product to someone who isn't Jewish that helps them celebrate their religion? And for example, if I own greeting cards and I have a greeting card that says Merry Christmas, am I allowed to sell a card that says Merry Christmas if Christianity is an idolatrous religion? That's how that discussion, it doesn't use Christmas cards, but that's how that discussion begins in the Talmud. And the answer that they give ultimately, and it's a very, very long discussion, is that Christianity is a monotheistic religion. I will say that there's many commentators who come along after that and say that they only arrived at that opinion because they were afraid of being killed by Christians if they said that Christianity was a idolatrous religion. So you are right, and there's no question that Maimonides, unlike Islam, which Maimonides had basically favorable things to say about, Maimonides rejected Christianity as a monotheistic religion. But by and large, the opinion of the Talmud, for better or for worse, is that Christianity is a monotheistic religion.
I saw a video.
Go ahead. A last question, I want to go to this guy.
Rabbi.
Joseph Soloveitchik.
So you respect him.
I do.
He said that the language of faith of a particular community is totally incomprehensible to the men of a different faith community.
Yes, he did.
And he said, hence the confrontation should occur not at the theological, but at a mundane, humane level.
Right, and what he was referring to in that section is whether or not we should engage in interfaith relations, not whether we should buy into, if I'm a Jew, that I buy into Islam or Christianity, or if you're a Muslim, you buy into Judaism. He was referring to, is it appropriate for Jews to be involved in interfaith dialogue? And his argument was that the purpose of interfaith dialogue is for us to decide that we're all neighbors in Westwood, and we're Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus, and we're living together. I don't need to agree with you or even think your religion is legitimate, but if we can fight poverty, we should. That was what his point of view with that statement was. And I do respect the Rob, but that doesn't mean I agree with him with everything he says. He was a great man, though. Go ahead.
I have a question about your reference to Hitler in the Ninth Commandment, but maybe before it, because you did mention interfaith, and because we are sitting in a place which is our hosts are Muslim, maybe it's important to point out that today in Judaism, Christianity is absolutely considered as a monotheistic religion.
No question.
Oh, no, because the
Right.
discussion here may point out to the fact that there is a big discussion. There isn't that.
Right. In Judaism, there is no discussion. As I said, the Talmud's point of view prevails, Maimonides notwithstanding, and everybody today in Judaism accepts Christianity as a monotheistic religion. And all the chief rabbi of Israel, the reform rabbi of Tarzana, everybody in between accepts Christianity as a monotheistic religion. That is true.
Now, to Hitler, you said prohibition against false witness if one did not experience either something bad happening to that person or witnessed in one's own eyes, which means as a son and grandson of Holocaust survivors, what am I prohibited of saying about the Holocaust? Or is that not appropriate for this discussion?
So the prohibition against false witness applies primarily to what you would be called to testify either in a civil court or in a Beit Din or a Jewish law court that's acting civilly. So if you were called to testify against Hitler right today, if that could be said.
No, but what will happen in 20 years when the Holocaust survivors will not be here?
This doesn't apply because they're not in you're not in a Jewish law court. So you can say, you can.
In the court of public opinion, it will be okay?
Yes, court of public opinion. These all apply to taking place in a Jewish criminal or civil court under which somebody is going to be punished. It does not necessarily, this one does not apply to, there are others that do, but this one does not apply to your opinion about something that happens and sharing that in the public marketplace. This is merely a baked-in referenced kind of thing. So if somebody's on trial and faces going to jail, this applies. This doesn't apply to you standing up and saying that the Holocaust happened, my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents suffered and were victimized, were killed in the Holocaust, and we should remember that. Those are two separate incidents, and this isn't speaking of.
Even if it would be in a court of law where there would be a Holocaust denier that would say the Holocaust actually did not happen. So we are back to not to a Jewish court of law, but I mean to a court of law.
Right. And there, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, what this would require you to do would be to say produce a testimony by your grandmother or by a grandfather that says, here is my grandmother or grandfather's testimony, they're no longer here. There's actually, it's a long, complicated situation, but that's what I would interpret this to mean. So,
Well, thank you so much.
sure, pleasure.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, for
Pleasure.
introducing us the basics and also the details of Judaism. That was great. It was great perspective. Well, we had our audience here, but there are also 10 live viewers from Periscope. There's a new application on Apple through Periscope. You can follow us through our Twitter account. The Pacific Institute has a Twitter account, so through Periscope, you can, if you download Periscope on your mobile apps, then you'd also be able to see it live, whether you're in Irvine, on the East Coast, or around the world, you can still watch us. So thank you for being with us.